welcome y'all to Sustaining Ways uh, Black History Celebration event. We're so glad that y'all could attend. We just want to give y'all a welcome and go through some Zoom meeting instructions. Just wanted to let you know, uh, please mute your mics when others are presenting. Our speaker for today throughout the meeting, you will have a chance to ask Q&A during the end tail of the session. And also, if you have any kind of questions when you're in the middle of it, you can put those questions in the chat. And at the end, one of our coordinators will be asking those questions to the guest speaker today. So please do that so you can have them, you can put it down fresh, and we'll have as many questions as we can because we do want to get to all of those. Okay. We also will be on Facebook Live today so just let everybody know. And I just wanted to professionally welcome y'all to Sustaining Ways open house event. Like I said, the Black History Celebration. My name is Oscar Bennett, and I'm the executive coordinator here at Sustaining Way. I will serve as your host for our Black History Lunch and Learn. Sustaining Way, I just want to tell you, Sustaining Way is an interfaith nonprofit that educates, demonstrates, and collaborates to empower South Carolina communities to cultivate a sustainable and equitable future. Our base of operations and educational center is located in the Nicholtown area. Our flagship project, Annie's House, is an affordable, highly energy efficient home surrounded by an urban garden. Everything we do is in an effort to care for people and the environment in a sustainable way. I'm very excited today that you accept our invitation to join us for this important conversation about African heritage and contributions. I want to quickly introduce our team. Our founder, Rick Joy, he wasn't able to make it today.
I'm on, but
I'm sorry, I
yeah,
didn't see you.
I've got some things going on in the background, so I'm not going to use my video, but I am on. So welcome. Thank you all for joining.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Our new executive coordinator, our executive director, Michael Brown.
Hello, good to see everyone. Thanks for being here today.
Our program director, Alicia Brewster. Michelle Desmarais, Sustainable Educational Coordinator and Team Lead. I know I messed up your name, Michelle. I'm so sorry.
Me too.
Zana Ellison, Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator. Danielle Parks, Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator and Community Coordinator. Amber Jacobson, Community Engagement Intern. Chastity Taylor, our Research Intern. Jasmine Pritchard, Executive Intern. Connor Campbell and Gerkayla Small are SCIPL interns. Miss Ebony Flowers, our SCIPL Communication Specialist, and Miss Rhonda Young, our Community Ambassador. And again, my name is Oscar Bennett. I'm the Executive Coordinator here at Sustaining Way. And I just want to frame the event. This Black History event will be taking us back into ancient Africa and the different civilizations that formed there, the contributions they made, and how that affects the world we live in today. Our guest speaker is a professor at Furman University, Dr. Eric Ching. Just want to read a brief bio by him. Eric Ching is a professor of history at Furman University, where he has worked since 1998. He received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1997. He teaches courses on Latin American, African, and world history, and he has led multiple study away programs to South Africa and Central America. His research specialization is social movements in the 20th century El Salvador, and he has published numerous books and articles on this subject. He has also co-edited 3 volumes of sources on African history under the Problems series with Marcus Wiener Publishing, starting with Problems in African History, the Pre-Colonial Centuries. And now I'll give it over to Dr. Eric Ching.
There we go. Good. Excuse me. That mute button comes in handy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful to make the connection with Sustaining Way, and I've in the sort of prep meetings we've had, I've really had a wonderful time getting to know the staff members there, and it's a pleasure for me to make this connection and be here with you. As Oscar was saying, I understand what the goal and objective of our time here is today, which was basically set up as can we have an appreciation of what we sometimes call ancient Africa, but Africa sort of after Egypt and prior to the arrival of the Europeans on the Atlantic coast and therein the initiation of the transatlantic slave trade, to have a sense as to what we can understand was happening in the continent of Africa, and as Oscar said, some of its contributions or its role in the world at that time. So that's obviously a pretty big challenge, but it's also a manageable one. And obviously, we're going to have to pick and choose what we want to talk about. But I think we can effectively do this. I just want to quickly, I'm going to kind of be jumping in and out of some screen sharing. I have a PowerPoint with a few things on it, and then I've got some video clips that I'd like to share with you. So I'll sort of be maneuvering around a little bit, but I'll just start out first by saying, let me jump over to this PowerPoint. I put up here the name of 3 different or 4 different video series here, just to say that this is something exactly what I'm being asked to do here has been a very somewhat recent but very much an intentional effort by PBS and the BBC and a couple of other foundations out there. But I just want to share with you, these are all readily available in some way, shape, or form. But we'll be taking a look at a little bit of this. But the first one that really set out to do this was Basil Davidson's Africa series. Goes all the way back to 1984, but is still very well done and relevant. Basil Davidson is a British professor, one of the first and founding figures of the field of African history. Then there's this newer one with a woman from the Sudanese woman here, Badawi, which is a 9-part series, and there are 13 more forthcoming if they're not already here. But I've understand they've been made and are waiting to air on BBC before they get released. I ran across this podcast series recently, which is The Story of Africa, which is a historical oriented. And again, all of these really, have a heavy focus on essentially, post-Egypt, pre-1500, precisely this period in African history. And then we have, of course, Henry Louis Gates's PBS piece, Africa, Great Civilizations, which is a 6-part series. And that's limited to members, but it doesn't take much to get a hold of that. And that's really quite an interesting piece. But I wanted to just go back and share very quickly here. I'm going to now screen share something different with you. So I want to get out of that. And I want to go to here. And this is the point. So I am going to show you a 2-minute clip here of Henry Louis Gates's piece or series. And this is in these 2 minutes is where this is centered on Great Zimbabwe. But he says sort of why he made this series and what this meant to him as a young African-American, or, as an African-American, but what it would have meant to him growing up had he had the opportunity to see this. So let me see if I can make this happen. If it doesn't, Alicia or Oscar can shout at me and we'll, hold on. We'll get that sorted. Hang on just a sec here. Okay, so there we are, screen sharing with that. I'll get this up, and here I go with these 2 minutes. Oscar, I can see your face, so you make a funny face at me if something's going wrong, okay? All right, so here's these 2 minutes where...
And then what starts happening with the gold? So with half of the gold profits and half of the ivory profits going to the king, that gives the king all kinds of power. Now it becomes a tool of state building.
Great Zimbabwe's enormous significance can be gleaned not just from the goods it exported, but from those it imported into Africa as well. Shards of Ming Dynasty porcelain from faraway China have been discovered here, suggesting that great Zimbabweans like to dine in style.
During the Ming Dynasty, they were getting blue on white porcelain.
Really?
Yeah, which was used for making plates.
If you had said this when I was growing up, no one would have believed it. The myth of Africa was that all these Africans were running around, not being very bright, waiting for some European to discover them. But you're saying that's total rubbish.
The so-called the myth of a dark continent does not hold water. If you look at 1,000 years of exchange between this part of the continent with the Indian Ocean, the coast, and then of course beyond to the Middle East,
In
India
other
and
words,
China.
the world was multicultural over 1,000 years ago.
Absolutely, absolutely.
By the 1420s,
Okay. Stop screen sharing there and come back to you. All right, so I wanted to share that with you because there you have Gates, I think just in those 2 minutes, sort of explaining why he made that series, what it would have meant to him as a child had he had this available to him. So he wants to say that, that we want to understand this period of ancient Africa as multicultural, as globalized, connected to the broader whole, and that, the leaders of Great Zimbabwe, wanted to eat dinner on fancy Chinese porcelain, and that they were so connected to broader trading networks and broader societies that this is something that they were able to do. And then, of course, we can talk about the architecture of Great Zimbabwe and other things like that. But anyway, that I think really captures right there. I think what the premise that Oscar presented to me and why all of those video series and those podcasts have been made. So they're readily accessible to you. So I'll share those with Oscar and the folks there, and if they feel like making those links available to you, it's very easy to have some very highly produced with some vivid imagery available to you. But I'm going to do some things here very briefly that sometimes that they don't, which is slow down a little bit and sort of take it from. I got to get back out of that. Sorry, hang on just a sec here. Got to do all this shifting around to these things. And talk about this in a kind of a broader, abbreviated, but broader holistic way. All right, so I'm getting back to, all right, am you seeing my PowerPoint there, Oscar? Okay, wonderful. All right. So let me slideshow that. All right, so, oops, next one. Let me take a moment and just talk about geography for a minute and how it's going to relate to this, to history and specifically to this period of history. But very briefly, for those that may not know, as we look at that continent, first remember that this is 2.5 times the size of the United States. We're talking about absolutely massive distances. But as we look at that continent, we should understand that what we're essentially looking at there is one big giant flat plateau. Africa has very few mountains. In fact, almost all of the mountains, 80% of them are situated over here in Ethiopia. And obviously we have a few over here in Kenya and Tanzania and here Mount Cameroon. But for the most part, we should just think about this entire massive continent as a giant plateau. And in particular, right around here, right around the coastal edge of this entire continent, is an escarpment of, anywhere from a few hundred to sometimes a couple thousand feet. And so this coastline of this entire continent, or the coast of this entire continent, and the interior of the entire continent is essentially sitting, up about 2,000 feet up above, or 1,000 feet or whatever, up above the ocean. Now, on the one hand, let's just acknowledge something about what that's going to mean in time. It's very difficult in some ways to get into the interior of Africa because of that escarpment. There's only a few places, the Senegal River over here, and then down in here, in and around Mozambique, where you actually have any navigable waterways going into it. So when the Europeans show up, they're going to have very limited actual capacities to get in there. Starting in the 1500s. First and foremost, they're susceptible to African diseases. So you had a mortality rate something in the 90th percentile when Europeans tried to go into the coast. If and when they ever got in there, they ran into incredibly well-established kingdoms and empires, and they were no match for their ability to defend themselves. And so it really isn't until, the Europeans are going to have industrialized technology, that is, the machine gun and malaria prevention medicine to prevent malaria, and then eventually the steam engine that they can then put up in the interior waterways. And this is, not until the 19th century that they're going to be able to do anything in the interior of Africa. So that's the one thing to sort of recognize, is that this is a difficult place to get into, and Europeans were unable to do it. But the important thing also to recognize there is that doesn't mean that Africans were not connected to the broader world. And that's what Gates is referring to, is that when we understand this period of African history, of ancient African history, we understand that that the story is happening somewhere here in the interior, but this interior is connected to the outside. A couple more things that I just want to very briefly say about looking at this map, about the relationship between geography and history. So I don't know what any of us might have in our mind when we think, like, when I say the word Africa, what image might come to us. I mean, for some people, it's an image from the Lion King. For others, it might be a desert. For some, it might be a jungle or tropical rainforest or something like this. But I want to be very clear about something, is when we start talking about the history of Africa, and especially this word that should come to mind is savanna land. And this area right in here, this line between the Sahara Desert and the tropical rainforest here below, what we sometimes call the Sahel or the shore. Oscar, am I still there? It says my internet connection's unstable.
Yeah, you did break in and out a little bit, but
okay.
You're back on now.
Okay, very good. All right, but to understand that when we're talking about African history, we're talking about the history of the savanna lands. So that's this stretch right in through here. Most people don't live here. Most people don't live there. They live here. Today, a lot live down in these areas, but that's post 1500. But prior, this era that we're talking about, it's here, it's down here through this area, and it's down into here. And so it's these places where we're going to see the ancient African kingdoms and civilizations come to thrive, right in those areas, right in there. And then what we also need to understand, which I'll show on map in just a little bit, is you connect savanna land with water rivers, and then you connect those areas with potential access to international trade, whether it's here, across here, oopsie, sorry, I went away from that, or out here, and then you're going to have the potential for the creation of these ancient African civilizations. And we're talking here roughly between about 400 AD and about 1400 AD, that roughly that 1,000-year period, which is before the Portuguese, the British, the French eventually round here and then come around the Cape and come up through here. So that's the period that we're talking about. And I'm trying to geographically situate for us where this is taking place. So if I just go to a couple other maps here real quickly to sort of show this, these are the big river systems that are going to be important to us here. Obviously the Niger River starting here and coming in there, the Nile with its origins up here in Ethiopia, with the Blue Nile here and the White Nile coming in from down there. Obviously the Congo River, which drains the big basin in there, but in this sense is a little less important to our story because this area right there, obviously that area, and then here with the Zambezi, whoopsie, I'm running through it again. These are the areas that you're going to combine savanna, water, and then with international trade. And so we'll take another look at that. So that's just an image. I actually just stole that one off the web, but that's the image that I try to get my students and anybody that I'm talking to about this to have in their mind. And there is a little bit of a Lion King look to that. And that's okay, because that really is where the human history of Africa is going to be taking place, is in places like that. In the geographic range that I said. This is actually a picture that I took, which is another one in my brain that kind of captures that notion. We're up here on the Namibian escarpment. So this is a little drier than most savanna lands, but that image very much captures the notion of kind of this vast, interior plateau with a sort of savanna-like appearance there. So that was at sunset, sitting up on a rock kopje there in Namibia during one of the study aways. And here's then the map that I want to show you that when we're talking about this period, roughly after Egypt and before the arrival of the Europeans to the Atlantic coast, this is ancient Africa. And just as I was saying there, here's the area, the savanna lands right in there between the Sahara and the tropical rainforest, Ethiopia for all of its own reasons, but then these savanna lands down through here and in through there. And these are the places, and here's Great Zimbabwe, where we were just spending time with Gates a minute ago. These are the places where, where we're going to see these ancient kingdoms, ancient civilizations emerging. And this, then we can begin to talk about, and I'll show a brief video clip here, but this is just one example. So if we take, and I think I want to go here first. So this is a satellite image of the Niger River. So here's the delta down here on the coast, and this stretches all the way inland and goes like this and comes around. And then you've got this massive interior delta that rises and falls with seasonal rains. And so this is from satellite. This is the place where all this is taking place. And these are the trade routes that are going to allow for the transfer of wealth that, combined with savanna agriculture and cattle, the water and transportation routes of the Niger River, then, and all of this international trade, that is going to produce these. And the same thing is happening over here with the Kingdom of Axum in Ethiopia, with access to the Red Sea, and down here with Great Zimbabwe with access to the Indian Ocean coast over here. One other thing, stop sharing so that I can come out and see you folks, which I prefer doing rather than talking to the vast expanses of nothingness there, is something that we have to understand. Another very broad statement that I want to make to you is that Africa has always had more land than people. Land is in abundance, people are not. So as just an example, in 1400, the world had about 400 million people in it. 250 million of those people live in Asia. So the majority of the world's wealth and population is in Asia. You got 50 million in Europe, 50 million in Africa, and about 50 million in the Americas. And so you can imagine, in 1400, you've got 50 million people in some place that's 2.5 times the size of the United States. Now, admittedly, they tend to be concentrated into those savanna land areas, but it just numerically just goes to show you the statement that I'm making. My reason for bringing this up is that whereas if we think broadly about European history, and in particular in what we call here, the Middle Ages and the medieval period, Europeans are fighting one another for land, because land is the precious commodity in Europe. So you've got all these tiny little states that are just battling for every acre of land, and you can pretty much write, or tell the story of Europe through, kingdoms and states battling for every square inch of territory. That is not what is going to define these ancient kingdoms and ancient empires of Africa. They're not battling for land. And there's quite a rich literary history of, if somebody tries to subject a population to territorial control, right? And say, I now have domain over you because you live on this land. People say, I'm just going to get up and leave. And this whole great history of migration that has defined ancient Africa and pre-colonial Africa is because land has always been in abundance. And so when you look at the map of those empires, don't think that you're looking at heavily militarized entities out there grabbing control over land. What these are often described as, and especially the ones up in West Africa, is they're called accordion empires. You might imagine them sort of expanding and contracting, because what is allowing them to exist is their access to essentially to trade routes. And so as supplies shift, as trade routes shift, as people move around, the so-called boundaries of the empire expand and contract in accordance with those variables, because it's not the land or the territory that's defining, the kingdom of Ghana or the kingdom of Mali or the kingdom of Songhai in the same way we would talk about like the French monarchy or the British monarchy or whatever, or the small territorial states in what is today Germany. So that's a big statement that I want to get across, that what we're looking at when we look at, again, that map of those places. And now what I'd like to do is with those larger, broader statements made there about geography and this fundamental thing that defines ancient African history of land being in abundance, but people not, let's just take a couple case study looks here and sort of see what we're talking about. And I'd like to rely here on Basil Davidson and again, Gates to show us some of the imagery here. But if I go through again and quickly screen share this just to take a look here at this. So we'll start off with the Accordion Empires of West Africa here. And in particular, the famous ones are Ghana here, Songhai here, and Mali in the middle. And again, if going through with if I can, hang on a sec here. Sorry about that. It's being a little grouchy with me and I don't know why. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so here is what I want to say to that. Let's try this again. Excuse me. All right, back to screen share. There we go. Let's see if that's going to behave now. Yep, there we go. I'm moving now. Okay, so let's get this image back on our head here. So again, it's going to be access to the Niger River here. It's going to be access to all these trade routes that are going back and forth through the Sahara and up into the Mediterranean. Another interesting statistic, and I don't know if maybe you've heard this before or not. So what we're looking at here is this is really the supply zone. This is where many of the resources are coming out of. And you'll see that actually those empires are not actually necessarily physically controlling any of these supply areas, especially of gold. What they're controlling is this savanna region right in the middle where everything has to go through. So anything that's coming out of the Mediterranean, and in particular, as we're going to see, the salt that is produced up here and desperately needed down here, it all has to pass through this area right here. And that's what those empires are essentially built upon. And if I go to it, that's another image that kind of captures it. I just borrow that image right there. So this is one of the emperors of Mali, this is a depiction, and Basil Davidson's going to talk about this. This is a Sahara merchant here coming down from the north and meeting the emperor down here, and he's holding this right there as a piece of gold, and this is actually a Spanish image, and Basil Davidson will talk about this. But the statistic I was going to give you is that 80% of the gold that was in circulation in Europe prior to 1500 came out of West Africa. So we're talking about a massive and robust trade across the Sahara. None of this is going through the Atlantic yet. So a massive and robust trade across the Atlantic with significant amounts of wealth. And those empires that are going to emerge in there are going to be founded on an indigenous African cultural framework, which we'll chat about here in just a moment. So you see that what is going to happen when the Europeans arrive on the Atlantic coast, they're going to cut out that trans-Saharan trade. So first they're going to draw markets down into the Atlantic. But then what's the other thing, of course, that they bring to the table is Mexican gold and Peruvian silver because of their contacts in the Americas. And so that's what then, when you see these empires begin to disintegrate in the Savannah region there, it's not just the slave trade that the Europeans are going to bring that's going to affect Africa, but it's supply from elsewhere in the world. And then, of course, the creation of new transportation routes down through the Atlantic. So, but that's getting ahead of our story. Let me just go now to briefly to Basil Davidson talking about the trans-Saharan trade. If I can get there. So I got to get out of this. I got to go back to here, and then I go over to here. All right, here we go. Oh, thank you. That's nice of you. Appreciate it. The advantage of working from home. My 6-year-old just brought me a cup of coffee that my wife sent in. I was about to chastise him a little bit and say, hey, you can't be in here. I'm giving a talk to Sustaining Way, but he brought coffee. That was sweet. All right. Sorry. I should probably not put all that on the recording, should I? All right, here we go. Here's Basil Davidson, 2 minutes of Basil Davidson talking about the transatlantic slave trade. I'm sorry, the trans-Saharan trade.
Word about the wealth of these lands got out in time even to distant Europe. A famous Spanish map of 1375 portrayed the source and controller of that wealth. While the outline of North Africa was already known, the map gave Europe for the first time pictorial news of the far interior. Beneath the desert wastes of the Sahara, in the middle of the Empire of Mali, the map showed the figure of a Berber camel rider, who might almost be Ibn Battuta himself. He's shown approaching the mighty Lord of Mali, seated on his throne and holding aloft a splendid orb of gold. This emperor was rumored to be the wealthiest man on the face of the earth. In 1324, an earlier emperor of Mali, Kankan Musa, was returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca. Eager to enhance the prestige of Islam, he decided to convert his trading city of Timbuktu into a center of learning and religion. At the heart of this Islamic city, Emperor Musa built a mosque that set a new style in West African architecture. It was the beginning of Timbuktu's wide and well-deserved reputation as a focus of African scholarship, teaching Islamic law and politics, as well as theology. Writing soon after 1500, a visitor from Spain set down his impressions.
In Timbuktu, there are numerous judges and learned men, all well supported by the ruler of the city.
Okay, and now I'm going to run up a couple minutes here to one other part that I just want to show, that right here, and then I'll come back and talk about these kingdoms at their foundation.
Truly dramatic scenes, just because it shows a crucial link in Africa's historical development. Even now, on certain days, you can walk out from Timbuktu and glimpse the inner drama of trans-Saharan trade. On this day, these Tuareg Berbers who operate the camel caravans are bringing a load of salt southwards from the service mines at Taodeni, 500 miles to the north, a journey of 21 days each way. And on their journey northward, in the heyday of the old prosperity, they also carried gold.
Okay, so that's nicely done. That just really shows how, even though it was made in 1984, that Davidson series still has really got some great imagery and some he's very analytically spot on. So I'll mention a little bit more about him later. But here's what I want to say. That the foundation upon which those empires were based. Now, we see in that video, and of course, we know inherently that Islam is spreading into this region along those trade routes, and is part of the larger story of the spread of Islam out from the Middle East. But and the presence of Islam and the conversion to Islam and the presence of Muslims and the presence of Arab traders is a significant part of African history. But I want to frame it like this, is that those empires were rooted in indigenous African cultural norms. And the extent to which Islam had a presence varied from almost none at all to some, but it tended to be limited to the royal court and some of the more extended noble families that defined it. And so it kind of went in time, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. By the time you get to Songhai, the extent to which Islam is a more widespread defining feature of the empire is true. But as you go back in time, and still, even in Songhai, what we really understand is that the foundation, most people in those places were not actually Muslim. They practiced the animistic African traditions. They spoke indigenous African languages. And of course, the reason that the rulers of some of those empires would embrace Islam is, of course, for very practical reasons. Connections to trade routes, intermarriage can draw in alliances with regions far away. There's many practical advantages that these African kings and rulers in these areas would want to welcome those, welcome the connections to Islam and maybe convert to Islam themselves. And as we saw in that clip by Basil Davidson, the connections to a world of learning and writing and all the advantages that can go along with that. But without getting too much into it, the foundation of those places are indigenous African. And those rulers, even if they have converted to Islam themselves, they have to interact with and communicate with their people, the base of the population, in those indigenous African ways. Linguistically, they have to speak about African gods, not the Islamic traditions. They have to understand and respect the divisions of labor, et cetera, all up and down the gamut without getting too far into it. And we don't have time to really get into all that here, but that's, the point that I want to make is this is a very prototypically syncretic experience that defines ancient Africa, a foundation of indigenous African traditions and belief systems and practices and foods and culture and everything else. And at times here, and we'll see it again over here on the Swahili Coast, is ties to and connections to the broader world. And, sometimes that wider world would dictate to Africans how it was going to be. But these African leaders and people are also very savvy and analytical in what they're going to embrace and how and why and on what terms. And what advantages does it bring to me or not to make these connections to people and their beliefs. And so I think that's a really important way to frame what's going on here. And that's what all of those video series are really trying to show, is the splendor and the glory that we can find in ancient Africa, and also the complexities and the interconnections to the world that define it. And in those cases, really allow for the great civilizations and the great empires to come into existence. All right, so that's what I wanted to say there, to use the case study of, the West African empires to sort of set that broader stage. Now I'd like to shift gears a little bit and move over towards the East Coast. If I can go back to, let's see if I can manage to do that. I have a picture here that I want to show you, if we can full screen. And let's go to here. So we saw Davidson referencing that Spanish atlas that brought back stories of an Africa that Europeans did not have access to. And these, indigenous African empires. That's just an image I wanted to throw at you here real quick. When I say the indigenous African foundations of these places, that is a modern picture of a traditional iron forge. And it's sometimes debated as to whether iron technology came from outside. Did it come from the Middle East? Or was it indigenously invented? And if so, we know where the sort of origin points are of this, of iron smelting, and maybe it was discovered more than one time. These are all debates that go on in African history, but that image to me is a powerful one. One of the most important aspects of technological developments that's going to allow for these kingdoms to exist, allow for Africans to navigate the environment, is going to be the development of iron. And I don't mean iron swords, but I mean iron agricultural implements. And these are going to be indigenously made through indigenously developed practices here. And so this, if we move over to Great Zimbabwe here, which is, here's an artist's rendition of what we saw, of what it would have looked like in its heyday. We got to understand that the foundation of wealth here is, grains grown in savanna agriculture, cattle, which is a form of wealth in most of these savanna societies, with iron, indigenously produced iron, and then again with access to trade routes. And then that's when you merge all that together, that's the indigenous African foundation of state building and kingship, connected to an international world. And so that's just an image that I wanted to throw at you there that captures that. And now we'll go down and take a look at Great Zimbabwe. I just want to use this map quickly to say, this is where we're looking at here. This is modern day Zimbabwe here, and Great Zim is right in here. This is Mozambique. And this is essentially the Swahili Coast. And when we say Swahili Coast, that's at once a culture, peoples that speak Swahili, but it's also a geographic space that's defined by trade. And so we're going to see the interrelationship here between Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili Coast here in just a second. So let me get back out of there. Let me go to stop screen sharing that. And let me go take a back to Henry Louis Gates's, we'll look at 3 minutes there in which he talks about Great Zimbabwe, how it exists and why it exists, and its connection to Swahili Coast. And then we'll go back to Basil Davidson, who will, I'll take 3 or 4 minutes and take a look at the Swahili Coast there. So, all right, so here we go back to, well, not quite yet, hang on. Sometimes you gotta be smarter than the machine, and that's not all that too easy. Okay, now I'm in the right. Okay, so this is going to be, we'll see three or four minutes here of Henry Louis Gates's discussion of Great Zimbabwe, and then its connections to the wider world there. So do that.
Of urban dwelling.
Okay.
Sultan Suleiman's prosperity and that of Kilwa was built on a monopoly on the trade in gold and ivory from the African interior. And those very precious resources originated 400 miles inland to the south on the Zimbabwe plateau. One African kingdom dominated the flow of gold from the west, and the rulers on the Swahili Coast became its international brokers. This extraordinary African kingdom was extremely well placed to profit from the great resources it controlled. That way, to the west, people mined the gold. That way, to the northeast, people bought the gold. And sandwiched in between sat Great Zimbabwe. Location, location, location. Great Zimbabwe lies close to the most extensive gold workings in the ancient world. At its peak, as much as a ton of gold a year was extracted from this region. Incredibly, half the gold coins in medieval Europe were struck from African gold. But it wasn't just gold that made the rulers of Great Zimbabwe wealthy. You didn't have to mine the gold to become wealthy. Trade could be a gold mine too. Great Zimbabwe was known far and wide as Africa's Eldorado, a place shrouded in mystery and wrapped in tales laden with gold. The original site, which became the king's palace, began on the rocky precipice around 1200 AD. From here, his kingdom unfolded before him as far as the eye could see. Over the following century, the city spread into the valley below. The city of Great Zimbabwe filled this entire valley. Thousands of adobe buildings clustered around larger stone enclosures housed more than 15,000 people. Who were the people who created this great civilization that prospered and flourished here for more than 200 years? Its builders almost certainly were Shona speakers, ancestors of many of today's Zimbabweans, and heirs to an older civilization that stretched back to 900 AD.
So we'll pause there with that again. And I think that you can hear in Gates's voice, the way he narrates the entire series, that the tone of his voice, get rid of that. The tone of his voice expresses what he's trying to do with this. That is that the story of ancient Africa has been lost. That when he was growing up, he didn't have access to it, and he wished he had, because he would have had a different understanding of himself. And so here he is now as a very prominent scholar, and he has the capacity to gain access to the resources from PBS and to get the helicopter that allows him to fly over the top of Zimbabwe. And he wants to share how remarkable it is and how African it is. And so that's, I think one of the, when I point to what Oscar asked me to come and sort of do here today, That's really what he's doing with that series in particular. And to celebrate the remarkable accomplishments, the degree of I don't want to say civilized life, but we're talking about very highly sophisticated kingdoms with very complex internal social structures, but rooted primarily in what we would call indigenous or Bantu African history. So that's the Shona speakers are still in Zimbabwe today. It was probably Shona speakers that established Great Zimbabwe. But anyway, so that's to end here with this, but just to say that another clip that I won't get to, or another part of that talks about that Great Zimbabwe is that it's not built with mortar. It's all just stone stacked on top of one another. And so they're talking about that as an indigenous African architectural form. So the very structures of Great Zimbabwe, the argument being made there is that it's a unique African architectural design. Now, I think let's just be honest for a moment. When we go and look at these monumental architectural sites, just as we do when we go to the Great Pyramids in Mexico and Central America and the Andes and elsewhere, we're looking at elite society there. And so we would recognize that, as remarkable as the civilization is, many of the folks who were probably building that, outside of the architects, are going to be poor people. And we can only imagine what the relationship is between those very rich nobles and kings and the people that they ruled over. It wasn't always pleasant, we would have to recognize. But it's just a moment of throwing a wet towel on what we're trying to establish here is the distinct accomplishments of a uniquely African, indigenous African society. Anyway, I just want to run over very quickly with the little tiny bit of time we have left. This is one of my favorite parts of the Basil Davidson series, is that when he goes to the Swahili Coast. So let me very quickly just get back to that, show it quickly on the PowerPoint here to remind ourselves what we're seeing. And we'll look at 2 or 3 minutes of that, and then we'll be at our time here. So I'm going to screen share with this. Okay, so the Swahili Coast here. This is a culture, a society, the Swahili people, who have lived basically from here, as Gates was mentioning, that this is the Swahili Coast here, that all the gold is coming out of from the other side over here through Great Zimbabwe and into here. And this is happening all up and down East Africa. And so the Swahili people are here in this decisive zone where everything has to go out of. And they're connected, of course, to the entire Indian Ocean trading networks, which is, a vast wealth of resources and materials. So that's called being, if you want a definition of the middleman, so to speak, that's right in there. And without getting too much into it, because we don't have time and these are more details than we're allowed to, there had been a great debate about who are the Swahili. There's a lot of Arabic in the Swahili language, where these people, they have a lot of familial and ties to the broader Middle East and into the Indian Ocean. And there was a debate about, well, are these Africans or are they not Africans? Well, with the more sophisticated methodologies that we've had to analyze language and to gather oral traditions and to make the connections and understand this, it was determined definitively that the Swahili people are African. From the interior of Africa, they speak an African language. And just like the kings of Mali and Songhai, they found it incredibly useful and expedient to make connections to the broader Indian Ocean world and to the Middle East. And so that involves sometimes marriage. It involves sometimes raising multi-ethnic families. It involves allowing words to come into the language, but it's still fundamentally African people, African beliefs, an African language that is a flourishing civilization, society based on trade. And now I just want to go to that 2-minute clip that I love so much of Basil Davidson, where he talks about the domestic life of the Swahili. And if there's anything that kind of, I think, has the potential to sort of bust stereotypes a little bit, he's very coy about the way he does it. But I'll hang on a sec here. I'll let you look at that. It's up here at 37. Yeah, right there. Okay. Here we go. Let me get to that, and then I'll have few words of conclusion, and we'll open it up for Q&A. All right, so here we go. Again, this is Basil Davidson on the Swahili Coast.
Lamu was just one of many Swahili towns, built in coral stone all the way along the coast from Somalia down to Mozambique. The domestic architecture of Lamu has been no mere copy of the styles of Arabia or India. From the outside of a traditional Swahili house, there's really nothing to see except a blank wall and a porch with benches for receiving guests. And even when the handsome front doors are opened, there's still only a blank wall behind them. But once inside, it's a very different story. 600 or 700 years ago, when houses like this one first began to be designed and built by Swahili architects for leading men and merchants, there were few houses anywhere else in the world so well designed for comfortable city life. This particular house dates from the early 18th century, but much older examples of Swahili domestic architecture not only demonstrated a unique construction and embellishment, but were built to a high standard of what we now call modern conveniences. While the inhabitants of London in Elizabethan times were emptying chamber pots out of the window, Swahili residents of Lamu who could afford such a house as this enjoyed the luxury of good internal sanitation. These old Swahili houses spell out for us the basic aims that guided the architects in their design: to make the best possible use of local materials, finely plastered coral stone, necessarily short rafters of mangrove tree poles, and then to ensure a high level of domestic privacy, and not least to show off and guarantee the creditworthiness of the owner, so essential in a community whose livelihood always depended on the profits and the risks of long-distance trade.
All right. We'll end with that there. But I love that segment because I think that, you know, like Davidson throws in that little line there about when, you know, people in London are living like this. Here we are in this, you know, sort of sublime urban living, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And these are Africans, as he says, you know, it's all African design. So it's Davidson and Gates have a lot in common in terms of what they're trying to do with those two video series. So I'll just end with this. What I want to say here is that, and it ties to my personal story just a little bit in the sense that what those people, three, there's two men and a woman in those video series are saying is that, you know, that the telling of the history of Africa was lost because once the Europeans came in and colonized, they told African history through a European lens. And so my own personal story in a sense reflects this. So when I studied in college in the mid 80s, I'm now in my mid 50s. When I studied in the mid 80s, I happened to study with a guy who was an Africanist scholar. Well, he studied with another guy, Robert Collins was his name, down at UC Santa Barbara, which is where I ended up going to graduate school. Robert Collins was the first person to the first American-born Africanist scholar. He got his PhD at Yale in 1959. He had no Africanist with whom he was able to study, so he had to study with a Europeanist, but he wrote his dissertation on the Sudan, like why he wanted to do that. That's another question, but he was the first one. That tells you that the study of Africa in a formal way from an Africanist perspective is a very, very young field. The field had to be decolonized. It had to be taken back. And that's what these people in these video series are saying, is that they're doing with these for a more popular audience than the kinds of books that Collins was writing. So just the simple fact that me would be connected to one of the founding figures, American-born founding figures of African history, is a reflection of how young this is. And so it's not until the national liberation movements and the decolonization of Africa in the 1960s, the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, are you going to have African universities producing African scholars who are going to study this period of African history from a non-colonized perspective. And the final thing I'll say is, and that's exactly true of American history as well. Until the 1950s, we were told a story that was now defined as American exceptionalism, and it wasn't until the civil rights movement, until we had other voices at the table saying, that story doesn't look like my story. And that story doesn't include our contributions and or our sufferings. And I think we need to rewrite the narrative. And that's what's going on here. So when Oscar reached out to me and said, hey, can you do something like this? It's like, yes, it would be a pleasure to do so for all these reasons that I've just laid out here for you. And to say to you that this is what Gates and Davidson are doing as well in those series. All right, that's the conclusion. So I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to come and share with you.
Oh, thank you so much again, Dr. Ching. Again, we are open for questions. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. And we will have somebody read them out to Dr. Ching.
I have a question to get us started. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but we do have a lot of feedback on Facebook Live, so we will check on that again too. It's mostly just good
Why is he
feedback.
talking about his 6-year-old? And that's probably
People are just saying great event, and they're congratulating y'all for putting this together and thanking Oscar for inviting them. But anyways, my question is, earlier in the talk, we spoke about the myths that are told about African history, and I was wondering if there's any myths that you're still finding a lot of resistance against today in your line of work, since this is your specialty, and if there's any that you would like to draw attention to, because it kind of in the video you mentioned it was sort of the general myth of African history, and so I was wondering if there's any specific ones that come to mind.
Well, that's a good question. I think that I would just generally say that again, just exactly what Davidson and Gates are really saying there is that, but both of them start out sort of at the moment of the slave trade, and they essentially say that in most instances, this is the way in which African history is told. It sort of like starts in 1500, it revolves around the transatlantic slave trade, and then it dives into colonialism in the 19th century, and then it essentially becomes just an appendage of European history. And both of their arguments are like, well, what happened before, and where did that story go? And when they say that it was forgotten, it was ignored, or it wasn't prioritized by those who were seeking it out. And that's basically what they're trying to say, is that's the big myth that they're after. In a more specific response to your question, I don't know if I could, it's sort of like, it's sort of asking, well, there's so many debates about these things, but I'll just give you one that leaps to mind that's kind of an interesting one. And this is a little bit of an older debate, but this is something that we used to spend a lot of time on. But there was the question about, are Egyptians black? Was dynastic Egypt African or not? And it gets into the debate about, well, it's on the African continent, it's an African place, and therefore they were black, weren't they? But what about their connections here and there? And so it became really tied up politically. And there was a scholar by the name of Bernal, Martin Bernal, a number of years ago, who wrote a book called Black Athena, The African Origins of Western Civilization. And the title is very provocative, you know, that Egypt was black, is arguing, or African, and therefore black, and that he argued that many of the Greek traditions that we have that became the foundation of what we think of as modern Western civilization are therefore have origins in Africa. Well, as it turns out, you know, and so you can see how that would get really tied up with heavy political debates and some serious stuff. Well, interestingly, he never wanted to title the book Black Athena. He wasn't trying to make a debate about skin tone or race. He was just trying to argue that Egypt had huge influence on Greece and Western civilization, and that Egypt had huge cultural connections to Africa. But the publisher put the title on the book because publishers can be savvy, and it's like that title is going to make this that much bigger, and it did. But it's also a very controversial decision because that's not what Martin Bernal was trying to do with it. So that's just an example, I think, Xana, that can kind of get to you to show you the intersections of history and politics and myths or lack thereof.
Speaking of debate, I know your work also extends beyond the continent itself, but covers aspects of the diaspora. When you look at the presence of African people in Central and South America, clearly I know the reality can be summed up in terms of slave trade. When you were talking about controversy, I know there was also a debate that went on, and probably still does, in certain circles, about the presence of Africans that came either during the time of Columbus or in particular before Columbus. I know there was a book they came before Columbus. I've been searching more, and I know that was a big push during the 70s, and so debates like that. Could you speak to? Yeah,
Michael, that's a good one, right? Xana, that's another one that Michael points to. That excuse me, that there's the argument that Africans arrived to the Americas before the Europeans did, and that one of the examples, Michael, that is sometimes used. What is it called? The African origins of, no, I forget the title of it. But anyway, that the arguing that some of the Olmec heads in Mexico are actually African features, right? And it reflects the fact that the Africans arrived first and had, an interactive presence with the indigenous Americans beforehand. Yeah, Michael, without getting, I think that it's kind of been debunked that happened. I understand why the argument would want to be made, and who knows, maybe it is possible that, I mean, remarkable things have happened. People have migrated in tremendous, crazy ways over time, haven't they? But to suggest that there was ever a really any kind of sustained interaction between the continents before is probably not very sustainable. So yeah, but that was a very political hot topic at the time. Yeah.
Eric, we have another one in the chat. This history is generally not taught in schools. If you had to design a K-12 curriculum, what would it include? That's something that I wanted to mention, but kind of forgot to. Let me expand on that just a bit. This is actually quite interesting. Not only is it not taught in schools, I've had quite a number of African students in my classes at Furman, and they tell me that it's from Africa, and they tell me that it's not taught, that they didn't get it in their high schools. In wherever they're from in Africa. Now, on the one hand, that might kind of make sense. That some of these kids tend to come from prep schools and in certain educational settings in these African countries before they come to Furman. But that there still can be in many countries and in many educational systems. That when you talk about history, that's Western civilization. And so, yeah, many of them come and they're very intentional about taking the class at Furman because they're like, I didn't have access or exposure to that. And yeah, similarly, I think that the question that's being asked there, I mean, you're right. It's not, a very robust portion of, I mean, depending on what state you're in and what kind of latitude teachers have to diversify their materials, it's not included very much. But I think, you know, it's one of those things where the wheels of justice or whatever it is turn slowly, but they eventually, you know, make their way. You know, I think that from the civil rights movement forward, with the moment of sort of national reckoning that we've had with Black Lives Matter, you know, and just in the time that my career has, watching my professional career, you know, things are changing, you know, steadily and slowly. You know, we're recognizing that you can't, you know, to put it in very crass self-interest terms, it's difficult to be a successful person in the world without significant exposure to diversity, to other people, to other curriculums, and to broaden these things out. And so you're right that still African history is not, you know, a major focus of high school educations or K through 12, but I think these things are in motion, you know, more at least than they were recently. But in response to the question as to what would I include in the curriculum, I'm going to punt on that and say that's that's too much to get into here in this period. But I will say I love teaching this class at Furman because it's a real challenge. The class is designed to be sort of like African history. That's what we call it, African history, like from beginning to end. So on the one hand, you say, well, that's just ridiculous. Why would you do that? But hopefully what you saw here is what you can accomplish when you actually take that on, like being able to draw those comparisons to, well, European kingdoms were all about controlling land, and these African kingdoms down here were something different, and they were all interconnected globally into these global trade routes. It makes it a human story rather than a you know, a narrow particular geographical story. So I really enjoy tackling the story of the continent and try to do that in one semester. So, but I will say something I ran across, which is really amazing, and I didn't include the link there, but there are African study centers, many, and I was just actually playing around in the one at Boston University, and they specifically have K through 12 curriculum and all sorts of resources that a K through 12 teacher could access. And it's very clear what they're trying to say. African history is not taught enough. It's difficult to do. Not very many people have specializations in it, but here's how we can help. Take a look at this. Here's a curriculum. Here's online resources. Here's primary resources. It can be done. So I'll just respond to the question like that.
Well, the continent as large as Africa is, and recognizing the East Coast, could you speak to the resurgence of Swahili as a language? I understand that South Africa has now called for it to be implemented. There's a lot of its programs, and just within the region itself, what is the driver for Swahili to take off within that region?
Oh, I haven't heard that. I'm sorry about South Africa, about Swahili going in as becoming one of the recognized languages in South Africa. That's really interesting. I wasn't familiar with that. Let's see. I don't know if I'm not sure that I have necessarily an answer for that. That would be a particularly well-informed one, other than to say that from my experiences, both in scholarship and personally that I've seen, Swahili has a kind of, well, the Swahili get around a lot, you know, as a trading people. It covers a vast, when you cover that whole East Coast like that, you're connected to a whole lot of Africa inland. And Swahili kind of becomes a sort of lingua franca, you know, a kind of common language of people. I mean, most Africans speak multiple languages anyway, but it can kind of become the one that many different people in many different locations kind of have, and it can be kind of a little bit universalized in that way.
Yeah, I think that was one of the driving forces for it to be recognized. And obviously, English being one of the, you know, major languages throughout the entire continent.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think that was one of the reasons.
Yeah.
I have a question, Dr. Ching. I know you talked a lot about the writings of the ancient African civilizations and the books, and especially in Timbuktu, I've heard, having significant libraries. But when I was younger, I also heard in a lot of documentaries that, ancient Africa based most of their traditions and things like that on orally transporting them. And they tried to make that a connection to, because there was an oral tradition, when they didn't write things down, that made them less civilized. And from what you were telling us, it seems that they had a plethora of books and all kinds of things that they were writing down, and scholarly lectures and things that they were trying to do. So could you just speak to that, the contrast?
Good point there, Oscar. Yeah, the simple fact of the matter is that when we're talking about indigenous African, I mean, sometimes I use the word indigenous, and Africanists would look at me and say, well, actually, is the Khoisan, people who are the real indigenous Africans. So you can't call the so-called Bantu-speaking Africans indigenous, because they sort of went over on top of the Khoisan. But I'll say it anyway. The indigenous African cultures here that we're talking about, they were oral. And so, yes, you're going to see the books and the connections to a broader, writing culture in specific places, like what you saw there, the connections with Islam and the connections to the wider trading world. Similarly, over there on the Swahili Coast and elsewhere. But yeah, I think the way to phrase that, Oscar, is that you can see how that, going back to Xana's question, about how we can sort of fit this into this myth about, about ancient Africa, that because it was oral, it was somehow less. Well, it's unfortunate that oral does not leave records behind as well as writing, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to find evidence for the story, right? But it doesn't make it in any way less sophisticated or civilized or whatever, along the lines of what you're saying. So that is correct. And it is one of the first things that you learn when you get into studying African history. It's like, well, the sources are different. You're going to deal with oral traditions that have been passed down for maybe hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, what happened is those things were being passed down. How are oral traditions used by the people who are telling them? You have to understand that you have to go to architecture, archaeology to tell these stories. Now we're getting down to the point where we're able to use genetic tracing to find out where plants came from and where folks moved around. You have to do linguistic analysis. And once we became more sophisticated with that was a huge key to unlocking the story of ancient Africa, like knowing that Swahili is an indigenous African language. But we can only do that when we learn how to do linguistic analyses that linguistically, genetically connect Swahili to other languages inside the African continent, not to East Asian languages. So Oscar, it's correct that when I say much of this story of Africa, on the savannas, around those rivers, in the interior of Africa, those are oral cultures. And you just recognize it for being wonderful for that reason, but it's a reality.
Dr. Ching?
Yes.
My name is Glenda Morrison Fair. Thank you so very much for your, I guess, enlightening the public on all the research that you've done. But I'm in the field of education, and something struck me when you talked about teachers and the delivery of African history to students. And it depends, you're right, on different states and what their criteria is. But in South Carolina, we have a mandate, supposedly, but we do have one, 59-29-55. Are you familiar with that?
I am not.
Is that all African American history should be taught in all curriculums across the state of South Carolina. But my question is, how can you encourage us to encourage higher learning institutes, especially in teacher education programs, to require that their teachers take courses like yours. Because once people understand the truth, most teachers don't mind delivering the truth. But I found that most teachers have no idea of what you talked about today.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like some suggestions.
Well, you might be surpassing my range of capacity there, Glenda, to be honest with you. When you start talking about, well, anyway, I have a question for you, Glenda. Did that policy that you were mentioning right there, did you say that was African American history or African history?
I will read it to you. It's instructional section 59-29-55. And it says it was passed in 89-90. By the 89-90 school year, each public school of the state must instruct students in the history of the Black people as a regular part of its history and social studies courses. Most people don't even know that's on the books.
I would imagine. And I would imagine it's probably not particularly well enforced, right? Is that what you'd be trying to say as well?
Absolutely not.
Yeah. Well, Glenda, I may have to kind of punt on this one a little bit because I would probably, you know, I can imagine some things that I would say here about, you know, the need for top-down leadership on that. You know, it needs to come from the state, you know, the Secretary of Education, or not Secretary, what do we call our
That's it, Secretary of Education.
Secretary of Education, right? You know, which is going to take you know, which is going to be led by the governor, you know, to a certain extent, which is going to have to respond to a voting public who is going to have to want to see these things happen for their children in schools. And how does all that come to take place? Well, sounds like a lot of politics to me, right, Glenda?
Absolutely.
I mean, the pressure has to come that says that, you know, we want this. So I think it's quite interesting what you read to me there. I'm glad to know about that. But, you know, I would assume that the answer is there, that intense interconnection between supply and demand in a politicized environment. And, you know, we as citizens need to demand it. The teachers want to teach it. And the people who make those decisions need to feel the pressure on it, right?
Absolutely. I thought maybe we could start from the bottom up as opposed to the top down.
There you go. That make them listen. That's right.
Thank you very much for today.
Yeah, it's nice having you here.
Dr. Ching, this is Jocelyn Slaughter. I thank you as well. I'm the one that asked the question about the K through 12 curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
And then you made a point that given all the unrest and different things that people might be more interested or more inclined to share more on African history or even African American history. But I wanted to push back a little bit on that. I don't necessarily agree with that, given pushback on the 1619 project, not necessarily here in South Carolina, but in other areas.
Yeah. So you're Jocelyn, you're saying that it's not necessarily going forward, or it's one step forward, two steps back, or something like that. Is that what you're kind of?
Yes.
You're not going to get me to disagree with you on that. But, you know, I just think of, I'm speaking more from higher education, you know, college level here, because that's the arena that I've lived in. But we've watched and seen, and I've been in the middle of these debates, that we should no longer be teaching Western civilization by itself. And, you know, at Furman, we abandoned it. You know, the American history curriculum has been significantly changed, you know, since what I talked about, you know, the old traditional American exceptionalist story that, you know, defined all the textbooks up into the 1950s. We can still find it, you know, but they have been changed. They have been affected over time, because, you know, again, it's long and it's slow, but the civil rights movement and the decolonization movements in the world really had profound impacts on who has access to the table to tell the story. I agree with you, Jocelyn, of course, but there has been, you know, and I've watched things like, you know, for example, in Latin American studies, you know, like Rigoberta Menchu's memoir, about from the Indian woman in Guatemala during the civil conflict there, that becoming more a required reading rather than what we would have traditionally sort of thought. So it's happening out there. And Glenda, to an extent, that's part of the deal too. And I think that's why those African studies programs, like the one up at Boston that I just mentioned, they're like, who writes the curriculum? Well, specialists do, and so, well, let's get the specialists writing a different story, and where do textbooks come from? And of course, I think, not to belabor the point here, but, the politicized nature of high school textbooks is, holy cow, and the outsized role that Texas has and the Texas Board of Education has in designing and disseminating, high school textbooks and the debates over that. But anyway, Jocelyn, I'm not going to disagree with you, so you can push back. But I will say I've seen change.
Okay, we're coming to the last 5 minutes. We still have some upcoming events we want to talk about, and we do have a video of our open house we want to show y'all at the very end. But personally, for myself and for Sustaining Way, we would like to thank you, Dr. Ching, for coming and talking to us and giving us this great information, and the Q&A session was great as well.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, and thanks to everybody.
Yes, sir. And we'd like to thank everybody again for coming. I'm gonna now announce a few upcoming events that Sustaining Way Nickel community is having. We have a climate and health intersection Zoom. Sustaining Way is not a part of it, but that is a Zoom that is coming up today at 6:30 to 7 at 6 to 7:30. I think Miss Alicia, do you have any more to talk about the climate and health intersection Zoom?
Absolutely. I hope you can hear me. My internet has been going in and out, but yes, Sustaining Way Faith, Power, and Light initiative. We're doing this in collaboration with the South Carolina Health Professionals for Climate Action. And this is a kickoff of a series that we will do this year with the South Carolina Health Professionals for Climate Action, where we will look at the intersections of our faith, our climate, and our
Miss Lisa, you're going in and out. I think your band might be a little low.
6:30 to 7:30.
Yeah, you're freezing. I'm sorry, Miss Alicia.
Yeah, Oscar. Well, I dropped in the chat a link so that people can join tonight. I dropped part of it in there, but it says tonight at 6:30, and the link there for people to sign up. Okay,
thank you, Rick. All right, sorry about that with the low bandwidth. We also have the Nickeltown Neighborhood Association meeting, which will be February 25th at 6:30 to 7:30. We can drop a link down in there as well for that. It's going to be this Thursday again from 6:30 to 7:30. Next, we have a housing and security meeting for financial empowerment, which will be March 11th. From 6:30 to 8. You can go on to sustainingway.org and register for that. It is a series. We've already done one of the videos, which talks about pathway to housing, and it's recorded on YouTube. So you can go to our YouTube site and look at that, and you can sign up for the March 11th session as well. Also want to talk about one of our partners, Mill Village, has a fresh out of the box community cooking show on Facebook Live tomorrow, February 24th at 8 p.m. You can go on to foodsharegreenville.org to sign up for that. They give out food share boxes, which is about 15-pound box of fresh fruits and vegetables, and the cooking show shows you how you can use those in a healthy, sustainable way. And now I'm going to share my